Everyone, how's it going this afternoon? Welcome to my podcast, the Praxis podcast, which is simply Praxis is about taking theory and putting it into practical application. And what I thought I would do is share something with you. And that is about 2 weeks ago, really a week and a half ago, I spoke at a marriage conference at the Preston Marriage Conference. And I've had people ask me about it. And so I thought I would record essentially my talk, but it's different because I'm here speaking on a video by myself and I'm not speaking to an audience. So the tone will be a little bit different, probably the intensity, um, all of that. But I've had people ask, and I think the content is important, and I want to share that with you today. And hopefully you find it helpful for your marriage. But at the marriage conference, they had me speak on a Saturday morning, opening up the Saturday morning, and they wanted me to speak on mental health and marriage. And so I literally for weeks was just, well, months really, because I was several months out when they asked. And I was like, what am I going to talk about? Like, what does mental health and marriage mean? What does that look like? And as the weeks got closer and closer, I changed my talk literally tons of times, changed my slides, everything. And I tried to think about what is the core message? What's the essential message of mental health in marriage? And I won't get into the story today, but I told a story about my wife and I and just our own journey of marriage over the last couple of years and just being in a place where doing lots of individual counseling, all of us, all of us meaning my whole family, doing marital counseling. I went through re-engage with my wife at Hope Fellowship where we go to church. And then I also did a regeneration, actually at a different church, mostly because I don't care if people know my story. It's just I didn't want to find myself as a therapist in my community because I have a tendency to like find myself in that role, and I need to do my own work. So I did that for about 52 weeks, going through regen. And so I say all to say that the last 2 years have been just a journey of my own mental health and relational mental health, and taking a hard look at that. And so as I prepared to talk about this topic of mental health and marriage, I kind of just essentially came to what I believe is the core. And I want to share that with you this morning. And I think um, if you take this and you apply it to your marriage, you apply it to relationships, I think um, you have a tool that if you practice can really transform relationships. And so there's a few things I want to just dive into in our time. And that is that number one, we're wired for relationship. And because we're wired for a relationship, we're wired around a couple of things. And then three, or really I guess that's four here. What can you leave after you watch this and go practically do? Okay. So, so number one, you and we're wired for a relationship. I don't think that's shocking to either any of you. That's not brand new, right? And I had this quote that I love that I put up, and you won't see it, but it's from the book Reciprocating Self, which is back here. The Reciprocating Self. I'm just going to pull it out. Phenomenal book that I think I don't know what quarter I read it in grad school, but it was in my marriage family therapy work at Fuller Seminary by Jack Balswick and Pamela King and Kevin Reimer. It's just a deep, deep book that I've grown a lot from. But they say this in the Reciprocating Self. To bear the image of God is to live in reciprocating relationships with God and our fellow human beings. Let me say it again. To bear the image of God is to live in reciprocating relationships with God and our fellow human beings. So as people who bear the image of God, what we're called to do is live in reciprocating relationships. And essentially, I think how I understand that is that we move in and out in a continuous relationship that is giving and taking and receiving. That what happens over here impacts over here. What reverberates over here reverberates over here. That we are not people who live on an island, all right? That anything and everything we do is reciprocating in relationships, and people feel the impact. That's why it's really important when you think about therapy work and working with individuals or any type of pastoral work or work in organizations, that we are wired in systems, we are wired relationally, that we have to think systemically. Um, it's dangerous to just focus on one person and think that just whatever they do has no impact, right, on the rest of the system or the rest of the relationships. And so that is important when we think about mental health and we think about marriage, is that you and I are wired for relationships. This is not um, an individual task. There are a lot of people who come in my office and they're like, if my wife would just, you know, deal with her anxiety or her postpartum depression, our relationship would be fine, right? Somehow the impetus is on that person, right? It's not about the other person. Or if my husband would just, if he would deal with his anger or deal with that addictive behavior, our marriage would be fine, right? And there isn't a piece of that that is true, right? That we all have things that we have to work on. One of the things I love about Reengage and really about boundary work is in Reengage, I talk about drawing a circle around yourself, right? And focusing on what you can control. Many people who talk about going through AA, they talk about the phrase of cleaning up your side of the street first. So we all have things that only you and I can control. We have to work on those, whether it's anxiety or depression or anger, right? Those are things that we have to work on. But I think if we're going to talk about mental health and marriage, I want to make this an issue for the us. This isn't just about the individual, but it's about the us. My mentor, Dr. Terry Hargrave, who's the founder of Restoration Therapy, got one of his books up here, that Fuller Seminary. I feel fortunate that the last 10 years, he's really taken me under his wing and mentored me about relationships. And he and I and a couple of people, his wife and my friend Tanner Hargrove, developed an anxiety intensive. And so I really look to Terry Hargrave. And one of the things he writes in his book, again, I like pulling books off the shelf, older book of his, The Essential Humility of Marriage. He talks about the us, this concept of the usness. And he says something I think really interesting. It's not as much as the two become one, but the two become three. That when you get married, you form this like almost third person, this identity, this third identity, this usness. And he says this thing needs, right, in order for it to thrive, we have to give to it. It needs to be watered and fed and tended to and cultivated. And as long as we do that, that usness, that marriage thrives. But to the degree we don't feed it or water or cultivate it or tend to it, that us doesn't thrive, right? And so it's really important to remember this idea that we're wired for relationships. When you get married, you and your spouse form this usness, and it has to, man, in order for it to grow, you have to give to that third thing. I think a lot about the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, three in one, right? They exist in this relationship that is a mystery, and they exist in such a way that they don't take away from each other, right? They enhance each other, but they're also their own individual essence, right? And so in a marriage, right, yeah, you have your own individuality and things that you can focus on and work on and take care of. But when you enter into a relationship, there's this whole other being that has created this mystery that needs cultivating in a relationship. And I think a lot of couples forget that. And so when we think about mental health and marriage, I want to drive home the point that it's about the relationship, not just about the individual. It has to be a task for the us. If one person is suffering from some mental health issue, or struggling mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, it's a task or a call or a job for the us, for both of you, right? Though there may be things that one of you have control of in your own life, you have to work on and take responsibility for. It's an us thing. As Paul says, we're to bear one another's burdens. We come alongside one another. He talks about in the book of Galatians, right? And yeah, in the book Boundaries, they talk a lot about come alongside, bear one another's burdens. But Paul later says a little bit in that verse, everyone's responsible to carry their own load. So there's this thing where in mental health and marriage, we're each looking at what do we have to take responsibility for. But we're a team. We're an us. And so to me, that's really important, really critical. And we see this early on in scriptures. In Genesis 2:23, we see the writers say, "This is at last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken." Verse 24, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And you get this beautiful image that many of you know earlier in scripture where Adam is in the garden and well, before that, God is created, right? And looks around and something's missing. And so God reaches into the dirt and he breathes life into it. He creates Adam, he creates Adam. And the Hebrew scriptures there, which I won't get into much, but when he's created, it's kind of this earth creature. It's lacking kind of identity. And one of the first tasks that God tasked Adam is to go and take care of the land, the very dirt he was created out of. It's just a beautiful, beautiful image. But then God looks around and says, man, it's not good, right? For this man I've created to be alone. And so he puts, really, he kind of is interesting. If you think about the scripture, he creates these animals and he sends them to Adam. And Adam's like, this doesn't work. This doesn't fit. It's almost a comical scene. And so God puts Adam to sleep, and out of Adam he creates woman. And again, there's some beautiful stuff happening there in the Hebrew, but it's when Adam meets Eve for the first time that his name is changed. He becomes a man and she becomes a woman. And so it's almost like he's lacking identity before he comes into relationship with her. And to me, that's just so critical, this idea that we're wired for relationship. We come into our fullness and who we're created to be in relationship with one another. And so I'm just going to drive that point home. You and your spouse, you're wired for relationship. Though you are your individual who has responsibility to take care of things and control what you can control, you are built into relationship. And so any issue that is happening to one of you is happening to the relationship. And so both people need to be responsible for the care of the relationship. The other thing I think about when I think about mental health is not just the things that we see in the news. It's not just the anxiety stats or the stories about depression or anger issues or addictions. Mental health is anything that impacts the relationship in either positive or negative ways. So I want us to think broad. Number one, that we're wired for relationship. And number two, mental health can be more than the typical things that we think about. So the question for me is like, if we're wired for relationship, what are we wired around? What does that look like? And so I kept coming back as I was thinking about this talk to an essential piece of what I think is at the core of how we're wired. And I learned most of this, I would say, from my mentor, Dr. Terry Hargrave, and he talks a lot about this in his restoration therapy model. But he's not the only person who talks about this concept. I think one of my also early introductions to it was in the work of Bessel van der Kolk, who many of you maybe know. He wrote maybe what is considered the best book on trauma out there. He wrote The Body Keeps the Score. And he talks about what we're wired around. And here's what Bessel says. He says, if you feel safe and loved, okay, if you feel safe and loved, your brain becomes specialized in exploration, play, and cooperation. If you are frightened and unwanted, it specializes in managing feelings of fear and abandonment. Read that again. If you feel safe and loved, your brain becomes specialized in exploration, play, and cooperation. If you are frightened and unwanted, it specializes in managing feelings of fear and abandonment. So what he's saying is we're wired around safety and love, right? You and I wired for relationship. And when we're wired in a relationship, we're wired around this thing of what is safety and love. My mentor, Dr. Terry Hargrave, he writes much the same, but changes the language a little bit. He talks about love and trust. Trust is essentially safety. If I'm safe in this relationship, it's a trustworthy relationship, right? If it's trustworthy, I feel safe. And so I may use the words a little different, but we're looking for this idea that in relationship, you and I are wired around love and safety, or love and trust. Now, we don't think about this often, right? But all of us come into the world asking the question of, is this a safe relationship, right? It's a trustworthy relationship. And is this a loving relationship? And we may not be asking this consciously, right? But from the time we are tiny, we come into this world and we're figuring out the world. Is this person safe? Are they trustworthy? Do I feel loved by this person, right? We're asking that question. And I can tell you, I hear stories and hear people talking about it, early, age 4 or 5. They're talking about an experience they had with an adult caretaker, whether it was a parent or a grandparent or a teacher or a coach. And that experience made them feel unsafe, wasn't trustworthy, or made them feel unloved. Now, I'm not the expert here. I've only read some research on this, and I've talked to people about it. But I think it's safe to say there is ongoing research that even the baby in the womb is being wired around safety and trust. Sorry, safety and love, or love and trust. And is not consciously asking that question, but is being formed by determining, is this a safe environment, a loving environment? They've done lots of research, for example, on women who have grown, not to say grown up, who have experienced time like in a refugee camp and given birth to a baby, right? And they look at how the baby's wiring and how it's just pumped full of cortisol and stress hormones, because it was experiencing the relationship of being in the womb with the mom, right? I think all of us would say, and I can only take my wife's opinion for this because I didn't give birth to our kids, but that is a symbiotic, it's a reciprocating relationship that the kid feeds off the environment in the womb, and also probably some external stuff right outside, hearing the voices of others. So I'm saying that we early on are asking the question, is this a safe and trustworthy relationship? And is it a loving relationship? And we make determinations based on that. And here's the kicker, right? None of us grow up in a perfect world, perfect environment, perfect relationships. You can have really great parents, really great family system, and it's not perfect. So there's always going to be some violation around love and safety. There's going to be times you don't feel loved by a family of origin or a caretaker. They're going to say things that make you feel not good enough, or like that you don't measure up. And they're going to do things that don't feel safe to you, right? And those may not be like what we would consider huge violations, but it might be like, I've had people in here talk about how one time their parent was supposed to pick them up at school at a certain time and they didn't show, they forgot. And that was traumatic for that kid. It did not feel safe. And as that kid got older, he talked about not feeling quite safe, that his mom or his dad had his best interest in mind, didn't feel safe, right? And so all of you have tons of stories. The reality is, everyone listening to this has had some violations or lots of violations around, do I feel loved? And is this a safe environment? And some of you who grew up in some pretty severe environments where there's been huge violations around love and safety, right? A lot. And so if we're wired for relationship and you get into this marriage, you're asking yourself the question, is this a safe person to be with? Are they trustworthy, right? And then two, is it a loving relationship, right? Is it loving? And I would argue if you got married at some point, you probably determined that they felt safe and loved, or maybe you had some questions, you weren't really sure. But the reality is, marriage relationships are difficult. Things happen. We have kids, we have stress, we got jobs, we have family issues, there's moving, there's finances. And so couples start doing things that may violate a sense of safety or trust in the relationship, or a sense of love in the relationship. So I'm going to unpack this a little bit, but here's a definition that I wrote. for my talk last a week and a half ago at the conference about mental health in marriage. It says this: optimum mental health in a marriage is the result of actions that promote love and trust, or love and safety. Okay, so optimum mental health in a marriage is the result of actions that promote love and trust, or love and safety. So when a spouse or spouses are promoting and doing things that make it feel loving and trustworthy, mental health thrives. That's optimum mental health. Here's the second part definition. While mental health issues in a marriage stem from reactive coping behaviors that violate love and trust. While mental health issues in a marriage stem from, or I'd say come from, reactive coping behaviors that violate love and trust. So when mental health is not good in a marriage, what's happening is couples are reacting and they're moving into coping behaviors, reactive coping behaviors that will violate a sense of love and trust. So for example, if my wife and I are in conflict and I withdraw from the relationship, I kind of shut down, right? That violates a sense of safety for her. Doesn't feel safe, right? Or if she were to say hurtful things to me that made me feel like I don't measure up, like I'm not a good enough husband or something, that violates a sense of love, right? And so we do this stuff all the time in relationships, all of us, right? We have conflict where we do things that violate the sense of safety and love in a marriage. And because we're wired for relationship, it impacts us at a deep core level. And this stuff comes early. These reactive coping behaviors, right? They come from early experiences. If we have early violations around love and safety, or love and trust, we figure out ways as a kid to survive those. One of the ways we might survive is to get angry, or to withdraw, or to perform and try to prove yourself, right? And so we move into these coping behaviors that help us survive. And those things come out in marriage when we're in conflict with each other. They're reactive coping behaviors. And those things create issues in the relationship, create mental health and mental health issues in a marriage, and mental health does not thrive, it declines. And so what does this look like practically? I put a slide up in the talk. I don't have it here, obviously, but here's what we think about when we think about love, characteristics of love. Here's what we see in the literature. Here's what I hear couples talk about. And there's other words to describe it. Here's kind of the essence. When we're speaking of love, if we're wired for love, that is this idea of being known. My spouse knows me. I feel known at a deep level. Maybe that talks about being heard, really known. We feel valued. And valued may look different in different relationships. We feel like a sense of belonging and connectedness. We feel seen, right? We feel pursued. My partner pursues me, pursues the us. We feel a sense of being wanted. They want to be with me, right? That's what it means to be loved. And when you promote these things, mental health in the marriage improves. We're promoting being known and valued and belonging and seen and pursued and wanted. What we see happen when there's violations around love, people move in a couple different directions, and there's just lots of nuances. But typically, if we start kind of high level, we see when we're violated in terms of love, we tend to blame others. It's other people's fault. We look to them, and different behaviors come out in that way, whether it's like anger or rage, or just blaming behaviors, critical behaviors, or we shame self. We move into this position of something's wrong with me. I'm never good enough. I'm inadequate. And that will take on a lot of characteristics. The second thing around trust, or safety, right? If we're wired around trust, what does that look like? Well, it means that this relationship feels safe. And you know what that feels like in your bones if something feels safe, right? And again, safe may be a violation of this person isn't showing up in a predictable way in my relationship, or safety may be real, like physical issues. There's abuse happening. So if you're in a trustworthy relationship, a safe relationship, it's open. There's not secrets. We're not hiding things. There's consistent behavior and predictable behavior. My spouse shows up in a predictable and consistent way. They do what they say they're going to do. Right? It's not one day they're this, and next day they're this, and next day they're this, and next day they're this. No, we show up in consistent, predictable ways. One of the things you see a lot in homes where there's some addictive behavior, maybe let's say around alcohol, they'll talk about a sense of lack of safety or trustworthiness because one night the person shows up drunk and then they're good the next day, and the next day they're good again, and 2 days later they're drunk again, and so this it's unpredictable, it's not consistent. A trustworthy relationship is vulnerable, right? And Brene Brown, who many of you probably read, she writes a lot about vulnerability, but it's vulnerable. We can be our literally not only our physical naked selves, but metaphorically naked and vulnerable in front of our spouse. And it's fair. A trustworthy relationship is fair. I give the example, like if you have kids, right, or you were a kid once, obviously, if your mom gives one of you one cookie and the other three cookies, that's not fair. Like you know that early on, right? And so we take this into our relationships and adults, and we're asking this question: is this a fair relationship, or am I doing all the work? Right? Does it feel like both of us are lifting the load and pulling in the same direction? You see a lot of this come up in my marriage work in terms of like what I'd call division of labor. Someone's like, well, I go to work all day. And so if I go to work all day, you're not working outside the house, you got to take care of all these things. And if you don't, that doesn't feel fair, right? Or sometimes you get two couples or a couple where they're both working, and then one of the spouses is also doing all the work at home too. And they're like, this isn't fair, right? And so trustworthy, safe relationships feel fair. When there's a violation around trustworthiness, safety, we see again a move in kind of a couple different directions. You can do both of them, but kind of a move in a couple different directions and then lots of nuances. But if something doesn't feel safe, I'm going to move into controlling type behaviors. If you don't feel safe and it's not fair, you're not consistent, I'm going to control everything in my life, right? So we see a lot of anxiety over here, a lot of controlling, a lot of perfectionism, maybe OCD type stuff, but a lot of control. Or if this is not a safe relationship, I'm just going to escape and numb out. I'm going to check out, you know, and that could be a complete disengagement, or it could be, people will describe I come home and my spouse is there, but they're not really there, not emotionally there. We could escape through substances, alcohol, drugs, food, sex. We can escape through hobbies and activities. There was a season in my life where I was running more than I usually run. And I think I was getting praise from that from a lot of people. Like, oh, look at Red, he's running all this stuff and he's healthy. But I think in my marriage, my wife would have experienced me as escaping or numbing out, and she would have been correct. I was escaping through that. And so you and I are wired for love and trust. These are some of the characteristics of love and trust, right? Again, love is being known, valued, sense of belongingness, being seen, being pursued, being wanted. Being in a trustworthy, safe relationship means that's open, it's consistent, it's predictable, it's vulnerable, it's fair, right? And so here's the question: are you and your spouse doing things that promote love in the relationship? And are you doing things that promote trust and safety in the relationship? When we don't do these things, there's violations and the marriage suffers, right? Our mental health in the marriage suffers. So a couple of questions that I asked the audience, I'm going to ask you, number one, what is one way that you can promote optimum mental health in your marriage through actions of love and trust? So what is something that you have control of, right? What are things, again, this is about you, your individual piece, staying in your circle. What are things that you can do to promote love and trust? What kind of actions are you taking? Are you taking actions that make your partner feel wanted and pursued and known and valued? Are you taking actions that make the relationship feel safe and predictable and open and fair? If you're doing those things, your marriage is gonna grow and it's gonna thrive, and mental health is gonna improve. If you're not doing those things, there's gonna be violations and the marriage is gonna suffer. And here's the thing: none of us do this perfectly. So this is not about being perfect. We're all gonna, over the course of relationships, make mistakes and struggle, right? But the question is, do you have a sense of awareness that you can actively in the moment be aware of and look at and say, I'm either doing these things or I'm not doing these things. And when I'm not doing these things, I can recognize that and course correct. Because in marital work, they talk about marital drift a lot. And that is that as a couple gets married, they use the metaphor of a boat often. They go from one destination to the next. The boat starts to drift. And if you drift and you're not paying attention, you don't course correct, you can miss that other island destination by miles and miles, be completely off course. So one of the keys is constantly assessing where you're at and correcting marital drift. And one of the ways you correct marital drift, I think, is to check in with yourself and saying, what am I doing today? What am I doing tomorrow? What am I doing this week to promote and to do actions that engage in showing my partner that they're loved and that this is safe. So think about your own thing. What do you have control of? And then here's the second question. This is a question for the us. And I asked the couples this in the room. What is one thing we can do together consistently that will promote mental health in our marriage? So you start by thinking about what can you do, and you think about what is something that the relationship can do that if we did this thing, and I would argue do one thing first, just one thing consistently for months on end before you add other things. If we did this one thing consistently, it would create more love and more trust and safety in the relationship. It would promote those things. Couples have all kinds of ideas. Some people, they double down on like a specific type of date night. Some people will do something with their spiritual life, get up in the morning and read the Bible together. There's lots of things you can do. There's not a right or wrong answer. Something that I would say that my wife and I have done over the last couple of years that promotes optimum mental health in our marriage is that we have found going on a walk together 4 or 5 nights a week for about an hour promotes love and trust, right? It promotes love because she feels wanted, that I'm pursuing that and that I'm there. And she feels known and seen and heard because I'm listening to our conversation, right? But it feels safe to her because it's predictable. We for the most part, 4 or 5 nights a week, we go on a walk. Like I show up for her, she shows up for me. That feels trustworthy, right? It's predictable, it's consistent, it's open, it's vulnerable, right? And those things, love and trust feed off of each other, right? So that by going on just a walk, it's promoting that this is a safe place and it's a loving place. And it's not magic, right? I would say that because we've been consistent with it for a long time, it's created a deep, deep place of love and safety that we can actually get to the good stuff, which are specific issues, right? Couples have issues they need to solve in the marriage, whether it's like, for example, financial or parenting issues or in-law issues, or work issues or intimacy issues. We have issues to solve. Couples cannot solve those issues, let alone even talk about them. Or should I say they can't even talk about them, let alone solve them, if it doesn't feel like it's a safe and loving place to talk about it, right? This is why love and trust is at the core of everything. It's not until you create and promote using that word again, just a ongoing, consistent practice that promotes love and trust that the relationship starts to feel safe and loving to actually talk about the issues that are impacting you, both positive and negative. So think of an activity, something you can do together in your marriage that would promote love and trust. And then I did something which I'm not going to do here. I guess you could do it, but I asked the couples. I gave them 60 seconds. I said before I leave this stage, I want you to look at each other and identify a day and time this next week you can sit down and talk through the answer to these questions and discuss any logistics, right? So if you're going to answer the questions and discuss logistics, like if you want to go on a walk and you have kids that are a certain age, you might have logistical issues about when do we do that, right? Or if we do date nights, what are logistics around that? So love and trust, people. You and I are wired for love and trust. But you put that all in the context. We are wired from the beginning for relationship. And because we're wired for relationship, how we're wired for relationship is built on love and trust. And there's always going to be violations around love and trust. So we have to be aware to promote actions and do things that promote, again, love and trust in a relationship, that makes your partner feel loved, that makes them feel safe. And if you do those things, your marriage will start to change. It will start to transform. I'm unaware at the moment there's like a specific book that unpacks all of this, right? But I'm a huge fan, consider myself a disciple of Terry Hargrave. I'm a part of the restoration therapy community and do a lot of work in that community. And I believe in that model. He talks about love and trust, love and safety more than a lot of theorists out there. And it's at the core, I think, of all relationships. And I think there's a lot of good theological underpinning to that model as well. So I hope that's helpful for you this week. And I hope that you can move into your relationship and just foster a strong sense of awareness that at any given moment we are violating love and trust or promoting love and trust. And depending on what you're doing will either cultivate a relationship that's thriving or cultivate a relationship that is struggling. But go out and practice it. Don't beat yourself up. Relationships are hard, they take work. And I believe in more than anything, the restoration of relationship, the restoration of marriage. I believe that we become something completely different and fully transformed in this reciprocating relationship that I could not experience on my own, right? And that's not a case just for marriage. I think there's lots of single people who will never get married or have no interest in marriage who can experience this as well. But it happens relationally, the relationships that we're put in. So I'm going to end there before I ramble even more. Wired for relationship. And because we're wired for relationship, we're wired around love and trust. So go out and practice being loving and trustworthy in your relationships, and you will see things change. All right. Have a good day.